I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Jay Edmonds to talk to us really about the mid-century plan for deep decarbonization. Jay is Chief Scientist and Battelle Fellow at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratories Joint Global Change Research Institute, Adjunct Professor of Public Policy at University of Maryland, College Park, Principal Investigator for Global Energy Technology Strategy Program to address climate change. He's got a book out on this. He has been a lead author on a number of IPCC steering committee reports and is on all kinds of panels and advisory committees. Too long to go into, but Jay, we're thrilled to have you here today. Thank you. Why does that say Joe?
Yeah, that's my brother.
We changed his name to his brother.
That's my brother. And he'd give you a very different presentation. Let's see. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the mid-century strategy and provide you a little bit of sort of the big picture context. Although I have to remark what a wonderful meeting this has been. Actually, I think the quality of the conversation here has been extraordinary, and I'm just delighted to have been invited to participate in it. I'm going to start off with 2 degrees, and I missed Granger's presentation, so I don't know if he showed you this or not. This is taken from a paper that Pete Smith was the lead author on, and I was part of that paper, and we were looking at some issues in getting to 2 degrees. And this figure, which is the ultimate spaghetti chart, is drawn from the database that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change put together. And what they did is they went out and they said, let's look at the entire literature. Let's get this quantification of all the literature that looked at all of the different possible pathways that could be imagined looking forward to the end of this century, out to 2100. And so they're color-coded as to where they end up. And so the red ones at the top take the concentration of CO2, which was roughly 280 parts per million at pre-industrial times, to more than 1,000 parts per million. And so we are well into uncharted territory, at least over the period in which humans have been settled. And then as you go through the colors, you come down to the blues, and the blues are scenarios that have the potential for the world to limit climate change to 2 degrees. They are 400. Canonically, the concentration that you're looking for is 450 ppm CO2 equivalent. And 450 ppm CO2 equivalent is also produces 2.5 watts per meter squared change in the climate forcing for the planet. And so those are kind of the benchmark numbers that you use. So 450 ppm CO2 equivalent. And so the blues are the ones that make it. They're in that range. They're probably color-coded blues because it's a very depressing scenario set. If you look at where global emissions are 0, that's the red line, they pass through, sometimes that set begins to pass through the 0 and go negative, and some of these emissions trajectories to achieve that 2-degree limit, that is a 2/3 or better possibility that the climate change will be limited to 2 degrees C relative to pre-industrial. They begin to go through sometime around the middle of this century, and then they ultimately, some of these are removing as much carbon from the atmosphere per year as we're putting in today as a planet. And so this figure has always troubled me, and so that's a troubling figure. So, like, how do the models actually do that? And and they all have a kind of a recipe, and so I think that is relevant pretty much independent of where you are. And the recipe has 5 different pieces. And so the conversation about energy efficiency, they all, all the models actually, and these are a wide range of different types of models, they all begin with energy efficiency. They reduce demand for energy as much as is economically possible, and they drive energy demand down. And I'll show you in the next slide that the role of energy efficiency can be very substantial in these scenarios. Then the next thing they do is they get the carbon out of the power generation sector. The reason that that's the next thing that gets done is that there's a lot of options, and the conversation that we had yesterday really was about, hey, listen, we've got all these options. Which is my favorite option? And so we had favorite options put forward, but there's you can continue to use fossil fuels if you use carbon dioxide capture and store it in a repository where it's not coming back. And we had a really lively session on that. There's renewable, non-biomass renewable energy, the wind and the solar, for example, also geothermal and other renewable energy forms. Then there is nuclear power, which we've been talking about. There was a session about that yesterday. Bioenergy, which we haven't talked about as much, but actually is one of the more important elements that comes up in these scenarios. It can play an extraordinary role, and we brought up yesterday this point about there's the option of bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage. And as a modeler, you look at these things and you see how the economics are playing out. And bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage, as you get past the middle of the century and into the second half, what you find is that these power generators are basically, given the value of carbon, they are basically in the business of carbon removal, and they have a waste product of electricity. It is basically the business model is that it has become that skewed because the carbon is extraordinarily difficult to get out when you're getting down towards zero. The ability to take it out of the atmosphere is extraordinarily valuable, and you combine that with the next step, which is what the models want to do, is they want to electrify buildings and industry. They want to get electricity to replace fossil fuels. And so they do that because electricity becomes relatively less expensive. Some models, in fact, will actually have an increasing production of electricity, that is electric power production, rather than declining as part of the solution in a 2-degree world. Actually, you produce more electricity because you got to replace all of the services that were being provided by the fossil energies. Then you decarbonize transportation, and here's another place where lively conversations pursue. Last week I was in a meeting where everybody stayed in their seats, but the conversation was one side of the room knew that there was absolutely no way that electricity wasn't going to win. Electricity always wins, and they knew that. Then there was the sort of the hydrogen camp that said, hey, listen, we can put a fuel cell on this on this vehicle. We can produce hydrogen. We can get it from bioenergy. We can actually use that bioenergy, and because we're pulling off all the carbon, we can take that carbon, we can store it underground, and we can make transportation from a problem that is a big emitter into a negative emitting technology. Same thing is true for biofuels. Biofuels is actually used a lot by the models. And then I come down to the 5th of these elements. And the 5th of the elements just flies under the radar. Nobody, I've never been to a meeting where anyone else ever has mentioned this. And it's really sort of staggering to me that it is so obvious. You have to halt deforestation or embark on a fairly substantial afforestation program. But the technology that gets left off the list is you've got to have crop yields improve. If crop yields don't continue to improve basically the game's over. That is, you need increasing amounts of land to feed people, and one of the unavoidable consequences of going to 2 degrees in a place where you're ultimately going to have a conflict of competing good ends is going to be in the food climate arena. So let me just sort of show you what 2 degrees means in terms of a scenario that was published in a paper that I published last year. And it has a baseline scenario. It's pretty much down the middle of the road. It's mostly about fossil energy. Coal, oil, and gas continue to grow, and despite the fact that renewables are a larger share of the total, it's still basically a fossil fuel world, and this is the world that people have talked about for a long time. Then 2 degrees, in contrast, are the two panels at the bottom. And the one on the left is a panel in which you have a full suite of technologies. And so each one of these bars, the gray being the coal, has a lighter or darker version of it, and the darker version is one in which there is no CO2 capture and storage, and the lighter version is the one in which there is CO2 capture and storage. And so you can see that shortly after the middle of the century, there is pretty much no coal left in the world that doesn't have CO2 capture and storage embedded on it. There's still a substantial amount of liquids in the system. There's still a substantial amount of gas in the system, but gas is beginning to increasingly be used in combination with CO2 capture and storage. And then the bioenergy, which you can see there, becomes a pretty big chunk of the global energy system, is predominantly deployed with CO2 capture and storage to produce these negative emissions that these models absolutely have to have if they're going to be successful. Now, on the other side of the panel, the second one has 2 degrees that it doesn't have any CO2 capture and storage, and this is sort of the world that we talked a little bit about yesterday, and this is what it looks like. It looks like early phase out of coal, rapidly phasing out of oil, and so as you have a transportation fuel that is liquid, but it's being produced by bioenergy. Gas is being phased out. You have nuclear and other renewables playing an even larger role. So so there are multiple pathways that one can envision. But those multiple pathways, every time you can get there with a lot of different options. And actually, I'll show you another where we take out nuclear as well and find a pathway. But each time you take one of these options off the table, the consequence is that it gets harder. You're going to have to deploy things into spaces where they would otherwise have been less competitive, and you're going to have to try to make them work in places where they aren't as well suited as other technologies. And ultimately, if you keep taking things out, you're left with nothing, and it's not going to work. So here's the wind success story. This is global wind deployment, and it has had double-digit growth over the course of decades going back, and it's actually one of the great success stories of renewable energy deployment. And I want to show you the next panel, which I always get a kick out of, and that is so on the left-hand panel is what I just showed you. It's the wind success story, double-digit increases in capacity deployment around the world, and on the right is a 2-degree scenario. And the 2-degree scenario is one in which I pulled nuclear and I pulled CCS. And you can see that massively successful success story for wind. It's the little blue down there in the bottom left-hand corner. And again, this deployment challenge that we have, I think, is one. I mean, 2 degrees is a challenge on every front, but the deployment challenge is pretty massive. This is one of my favorite figures. It was put together by a guy named Volker Cray, who is at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, and he shows kind of what the role of the sectors would be if you have CCS or you don't have CCS. And so the 450 CO2 equivalent is the same thing as saying I want a 2/3 chances of being below 2 degrees at the end of the century. And I want to emphasize at the end of the century. It doesn't mean that you didn't actually pass above it and then come down. And as we begin to talk about 1.5 degrees, as far as I know, there is no trajectory that stays below 1.5 degrees. They all come up and come back down to 1.5 at the end of the century. They all pass through a period where you have more than 1.5 degrees of climate change. But this is a 2-degree world. And you can begin to see why you need those negative emissions. Now, if you got CO2 capture and storage, the role of the negative emitter is played by, at least if you look at the literature, is played by the electric utility industry. And the way to understand this figure is the first column is transportation. The first of the set of 3, the red coloring is the range in the open literature for 2030, then 2050, and then 2100. And you can see that transport, which is the first column, increasingly you have lower and lower, but you never get down to 0 emissions in the transportation sector if you've got CO2 capture and storage. Buildings does the same thing. It reduces its footprint over time. Virtually to 0 because of the electrification of the buildings. Industry does a very similar reduction, again, with electrification, and then the electric sector with negative emissions goes deeply negative by the middle of the century. And land use and land use change emissions are more or less a wash, although some of the scenarios that actually have very negative emissions. Then you get to this gray stuff on the far right-hand panel. The gray stuff on the far right-hand panel is a real problem. It's these non-CO2 greenhouse gases that are extraordinarily tough to control. It's the stuff that it's CFCs seeping out of landfills. It is methane from cattle, from rice paddies. It is all of these different technologies that are dispersed, that are difficult to control. And so while those emissions are reduced, they actually end up having to be offset. It's really hard to get those down to 0. So the way it's offset if you have CO2 capture and storage, bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage. If you pull CO2 capture and storage out of the mix, then of course there is no bio-CCS. And there has to be some way to get the emissions down below 0. And the way the models do it is they afforest. They go out there and they put forests all over the planet. And so what you find, of course, is that all the other sectors have to do more. And you have, while the power sector only gets to 0, the other sectors have to get to virtually 0 as well. But the thing, again, where I find that 2 degrees is going to inevitably cause us to have to look at trade-offs and transitions is that there's no path to 2 degrees that is in the models that doesn't have a huge footprint on the face of the earth. It doesn't leave a huge footprint, one way or the other. The only way out is free air capture that will not end up with a major land use change, and that's a speculative technology at best. But essentially, this need to get to 0 to limit the change in average surface temperature of the planet really drives some very hard decisions. How does that play out in the U.S.? And that was what the mid-century strategy was all about. And I'll put the web address on the final slide, so it's up and available. This was released in Marrakesh in November at the Conference of the Parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And basically, it is a study that looked at a lot of different pathways, and it looked at pathways for the United States, with the United States explicitly included. It looks at a pathway that, for the United States, its primary case is one in which the U.S. reduces its emissions by 80% relative to 2005 in the year 2050. And so it looks at these in a number of different ways. And again, just as I was showing in this broader literature, this particular study, the mid-century strategy, looking at the U.S., plays out in a very similar way. It is, in a sense, that template for the world gets replicated. It gets changed depending upon the technology that you have available, the local circumstances, so things get bigger or smaller, but basically that template gets played out. And so you see it being played out here. The benchmark scenario has both some increase in uptake because we afforest, some negative emissions because we deploy bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage, and those offset some of the CO2 and the non-CO2 greenhouse gases. There's another pathway that leads, that has no CCS, but it has to do more afforestation. And then there's a pathway where you have to go deeper to get to that 80% because you have less offsets in the interim. In this study, while I'll take you through the benchmark case, in this study, what you find is that there are lots and lots and lots of pathways that can get you to the same goal, but they all have to meet, they all have to satisfy that ultimate constraint that emissions relative to 2005 are 80% below. So here's the benchmark pathway. The gray bars are the reference scenario, what would have happened had there been no mid-century strategy, and you can see that CO2 emissions would be growing, non-CO2 emissions would be growing, and we would have some loss in land use, in carbon released to the atmosphere through land use change. And then you say, all right, how did we get down from that peak, which is actually higher than would have been, U.S. emissions would have been higher in 2050 than they are today if we just let things go. And so again, you see the same pattern being played out. Energy efficiency is the very first set of activities, and you can see that energy efficiency is deployed in transport, it's deployed in buildings, and then deployed in industry. And then you see this decarbonization of electricity. So you get as much energy out of the system by using energy efficient technologies and deploying those. And then you electrify the power sector. You see some increase in nuclear. You see some CCS deployed with fossil fuels. You see a lot of renewables in the mid-century strategy case being deployed. And then you have fuel switching benefits to low carbon fuels and this deployment of electricity into the building sector. So there's reducing the size of the transport building it's in industry sectors, and then there's electrifying them. And the first energy efficiency accounts for about 2 billion tons of carbon per year, electrification for about 3, and this fuel switching and electrification for another 2. And then you come over into the negative side of the ledger, which is the sequestration of carbon, land sink enhancement, CO2 removal technologies, and finally some reductions in the non-CO2 greenhouse gases. And that's basically the summary of the mid-century strategy. It gets played out over time with a phase out of coal that does not have any CO2 capture and storage with it, reductions in oil use, reductions basically across the board in all the fossil fuels, and reductions overall in the scale of primary energy usage in the economy. That's accounted for by energy efficiency improvements, and then the substitution of bioenergy and the low carbon. By sector, you can see the same thing happening, that the coal without CCS is phased out, that CCS technologies deploy, that there is less oil and gas in the system, and low carbon becomes a dominant dominant energy form for producing electricity. In the building sector, electrification goes on. In the industry, electrification continues. And in the transport sector, you see both energy efficiency being deployed, but also this substitution away from liquid fuels. So that's a quick tour through it. As I said, there is a very rich body of work in the mid-century strategy, and the reference, if you want to get that downloaded, is here at the top of the screen. So thank you, and appreciate your attention.
Hi, Barrett Brown again. One of the things you didn't mention, I'm just curious whether was in the calculations, is soil restoration and carbon storage in soils to both increase agricultural yields and store carbon at the same time, and something that I know there's an active investment movement in this country trying to promote. So I would hope, well, I'm just curious what you have to.
Yeah, and so in the mid-century strategy, there actually is some account taken of switching over to low and no-till agricultural practices to increase the carbon in soils, and that actually is an important way to remove carbon and restore it to the landscape, and of course has a lot of side benefits that come along with it. I mean, one of the things that farmers are always trying to do is, how do I get the carbon up in my soil? And this, of course, is finding techniques that will allow it. Globally, it actually can be a significant share. Oddly enough, or I don't know whether it's oddly enough, but just it often doesn't get incorporated into a lot of the modeling that's done, and I think that it should be, because it does have potential to be a win-win. This is a place where actually you get the synergy between the carbon removal and being able to reduce the cost of which you can provide food to people. Do you want to manage? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to make a point that's often an uncomfortable one to bring up, but given the scope of what you said, it was a great talk, by the way, which is the cultural one. I mean, I think often when we do these technological analyses, we just assume that nothing's going to change about how we consume energy or go about what we're doing. We also assume a lot of things about population, for example, and I know the Hewlett Foundation funded a paper that was quite interesting a while ago that showed that if we just provided reproductive services to people who want them, the effect on emissions was very strong for a fairly cheap bill. So I'm just curious what you think about that. I mean, it starts from just like reducing VMTs and things like that to kind of major radical cultural change, but over the 80-year type timeframes you're talking about, those are things that can happen.
Yeah, I'm not going to have a very satisfying answer, but I think it's a very good point, and what people want, what they value, can actually change. And I'm old enough that I lived through a period where there was just this massive cultural change that occurred in a very short period of time. When I entered graduate school, everybody I knew smoked, and so you always had ashtrays around. By the time I left graduate school, there were no ashtrays in my house. I didn't know a single person that smoked. I mean, that's to your point, and how rapidly things can change. Part of the reason that I focused on the physical side was that I didn't want to prejudice exactly how this comes about. technically in the models, what they do is they tax the world. They give everybody a common carbon tax, and they do everything as efficiently as possible. It's a fiction, and actually it's a problem in the research literature that needs to be addressed, which is that most of the way that policies and measures have been successful is through looking for synergies with other issues where you actually are trying to combine things. And you say, look, for example, in Europe, and they lamented the fact that, well, the price of carbon in the emissions trading system was basically dropped to zero. And it wasn't that they didn't have a substantial reduction that was required, but rather that they had deployed a whole set of feed-in tariffs. They had renewable portfolio standards. They had all these other things that were being utilized simultaneously, so that basically they got the job done with a whole bunch of stuff that really wasn't the cap and trade regime. They didn't actually need the cap and trade regime. They had all these other things going on. And again, I think that speaks to a sort of an ancillary issue to the one that you bring up, which is, can we actually change what we want and begin to value, say, getting electricity that is from a source that is non-emitting relative to an emitting source. As I say, I don't have a good answer for it, but I think you put your finger on an important point. So let me leave it at that.
Jay, an observation and a question. The observation you do not have to respond to, but the website, the link you have up there is very long and does not say whitehouse.gov, which it did at one point, I think. It was someplace that it was available. The question is, in terms of the process that went into developing the strategy, how broad was that? Was it sort of, who went into that process, I guess?
Well, it was a U.S. government process, and so as you might imagine, there's a lot of consulting that went into it. There was a lot of developing of a portfolio of scenarios that were that actually covered a wide range of possibilities. What if we don't have this technology? What if this comes through better than we thought? What happens if? And so you end up ultimately in the database that was created out of this work. You have lots and lots of different pathways. So there was a lot of consulting that went on and vetting before this was finally released as a U.S. government document.
Hi, Dave Grossman from Greenlight Group. I'm actually not going to ask about politics. So I was curious about the bioenergy part of it, because it's one of the things that has not really come up much in the conversation so far, apart from we need at some point PECs to get to the negative emissions. But the source of the bioenergy is rarely discussed, and how carbon neutral or carbon negative it actually is. So in these models, can you clarify what the source of this bioenergy is, and where it's coming from, and how that factors into the carbon life cycle equation?
Right, and for some, it varies from model to model. If you look at the model that my group at the Joint Global Change Research Institute runs, we actually run an integrated land use. So if there's a net change, it is a truly net change. All the indirect land use change emissions are accounted for in that process. Other groups will do it manually. They'll actually have other methods by which they deploy technology on the landscape. But they're global models, and they, again, control for all of the indirect land use change emissions. There are actually several different, we talk about bioenergy as if it was just one thing, but I think there are like 7 or 8 different crops that we track in our model. Plus, you can harvest detritus, and so stuff that isn't needed to to farm sustainably can be pulled off and used. And actually, that turns out to be a very substantial chunk of the bioenergy resource that's available, as well as municipal solid waste, which is not as big as a piece. And then, of course, you end up with the purpose-grown crops that are of any number of different types of crops, most of which are not corn. So the models do control for that. And so to do that, and that actually is one of the questions that I think is an important research question, is what's the business model to make that happen? How would you actually make this all a going proposition so that farmers can have the right signals so that they plant what's needed not only for the food but also for the bioenergy that would be needed for the 2-degree limitation.
Aurora Sherrard, Green Building Alliance. I'd like to build on Dave's question and what you just said. Essentially, this crux of land use decisions and how that works with bioenergy, the amount of land we need to grow food to sustain us as people, and whether or not we use those lands for large-scale renewables, actual power plants, electrification, things like that. Can you dig into that a little bit more, like at the plan level? And also the one other thing that I forgot that you're one of the only speakers that talked about was afforestation as well. Like this land use is at the crux of many of these decisions.
Yeah, and I unfortunately I don't have any of the slides that show you what's going on the landscape, but it is fairly substantial, and it's always it's one of these things that when we first got working on it, it's like, how does this happen? How do you actually, what's the changes that go on the landscape? And, the way we started off running it was we said, well, all the carbon really, the atmosphere counts all the carbon. And so, maybe we should count all the carbon when we go off and tax the world. So let's count the emissions that are coming off of the landscape. And so we'll tax those as well. And so we began taxing the landscape. And of course, it resulted in the kind of transitions that I showed that had a combination of bioenergy with CO2 capture and storage. It had afforestation. And there's only the same amount of land here. What happened? And so in pulling that apart, what happened was the model changed diets. And what it did is, what you find is that, these models are, in some ways, you tell it all these simple things to do, they go ahead and do them, and they do things that are the logical implications of all that you had never really thought of yourself. And so what happens, of course, is that the carbon price means that anything that is creating emissions gets taxed, but anything that's storing carbon is receiving the value of the carbon that is pulling out of the atmosphere. So it turns out that cows are pretty carbon expensive. And so what happens is that the relative price of cattle to other dietary elements switch. And so even though people are all still getting fed, they switch their diet. And so what happens is that this land that was otherwise being used for grazing or to grow crops to feed the animals now is freed up and gets used by either to put forests on or to grow bioenergy. And that was actually really an enlightening realization. That's the good news, is that actually everybody has a somewhat healthier diet at the end of all this. The bad news is that because there is a significant new demand for land, that the price of things that people eat are all higher as a consequence, and that is one of these really tough observations that you take away from doing this work on scenarios that deliver 2 degrees is that you end up in this sort of tight space where, except for the strategies which try to restore carbon to agricultural lands, where you're trading off higher food prices against the sequestration or the bioenergy production. And so that's a little bit of an unpacking. I'd be happy to talk more with you at the break.
I don't know whether you've looked at this or not. The Penn State, in a study from the Pennsylvania Hardwoods Development Council about probably 10 years ago, looked at, identified a very substantial waste wood resource, really necessary to promote sustainable forestry in Pennsylvania. So that, of course, could be a source that would actually improve our forest health and could be used as a biosource for coal or gas.
Right, and that is part, as I mentioned, the detritus is part of this story. So some of it is coming off the crops, but some of it is actually coming off of out of the forest as well. And so that actually is a potential source of a relatively significant amount of bioenergy. And actually, if you look at the bioenergy accounts today, I mean, where is the biggest source of bioenergy use? Well, it's over there in the pulp and paper industry, where they're actually taking all of the pieces that aren't going into pulp or paper, and they're actually feeding them back through, so that they're using that as an energy source.
Well, also the green junk, the trees that are the poor genetic specimens. So there's a lot of that, and
just culling
in this for sustainable forestry. And a lot of times now they're cutting that and letting it lie and rot. Which
right. Yeah, it could have a higher use.
But just to follow up on the bioenergy thread we're on, I get the argument for the bioenergy role with CCS, but it feels like there's a debate still going, and EPA has this whole debate, or maybe at least it did, we'll find out if it still has one, about how carbon neutral bioenergy actually is and depends on the source, and what time frame you're looking at, about how long it takes for certain sources to have the uptake of carbon, and then how much is released, and is it carbon. So I get the CCS part, but some of your models also included sort of bioenergy without CCS as part of it, and part of my question was, which are the sources of bioenergy for that are presumed to be carbon neutral, or has it not gotten to that level of granularity? We're just assuming there is.
No, actually, and that's a great question, because if you don't run these models all the time, or you haven't built them, it's like, what's in there, what's in and what's out, and what's in the control. And the nice thing about these integrated assessment models is they're full system models, and so you have all that indirect land use change emissions accounted for. And it turns out that the policy environment that the 2 degrees is exposed to makes a huge difference. And a few years back, when this was first coming out as a topic, we actually wrote this paper in Science, in which we looked at these two extreme cases, one of which is you just tried to reduce emissions using fossil fuel and industrial emissions, and they're the only ones that paid a tax. You allowed the bioenergy to feed in as if it were a carbon neutral fuel, but then tracked all the indirect land use change emissions. And of course, what you end up with is a scenario in which you have a lot of land use change. You have this pulse of land use change emissions that is driven by the bio, because there's no control mechanisms. And then on the other extreme is this scenario in which all the carbon is valued. And so if you emit on the land use side, then of course you have to pay the tax. Now those are the latter is easier to do in a model than it is to do in the real world. And I think one of the real challenges is to think through what are the policies and measures that would allow or address the problem of indirect land use change emissions, and that's an open research question.
Right, but it's also not just the indirect land use change, but the actual direct emissions from burning bioenergy. The question of
Well, all the carbon would go that there was, that the plant took out of the atmosphere would then be reintroduced into the atmosphere. So from the perspective of the plant alone, it's sort of a wash transaction. But you've got all these ancillary things going on with it. I think it's where you have to begin to worry about, how did you get the bio there, and what was the emissions that went along with, say, the transport or whatever. But just from the perspective, if you're just tracking the plant's a wash, a transaction. It's all these things that go along, and I think that's really what you're saying, isn't it?
partly, I think there have been debates that I've been trying to get more familiar with about the time scales involved in some feedstocks to sequester carbon, and then it's all burned up in one pulse, and then if it's rapid, are there differences? Are there bioenergy sources that are more carbon neutral than others? Growing cycles. I mean, there's a lot.
Yes, right. So we probably aren't going to solve that, here and now. And there's a big literature.
Yeah.
See,
I have a question, but first to that question. I know with the wood, say for instance, residential wood pellet industry, which is a biofuel for heat. So right now it's probably a very inefficient industry because they used to recycle sawdust. Then when they ran out of sawdust, then they start using the remnants from the timber industry, which was just mentioned. But what they also do is they're transporting this sawdust in its raw form, which means it's like 40% water. So they're hauling water, and then they're also drying that not naturally, so they're using a lot of energy just to dry it. So I think that point is very well taken.
Yeah.
My question is, I once was on a tour in Sweden where they have, first of all, developed fast-growing trees, and they also grow them directly around thermal plants. So we're not talking about electricity generation, but they did a lot with was a willow tree just for heat generation. And then also, you mentioned municipal waste just purely for heat generation. And I just wondered, do you look at those types of things when you're, as examples that are good or bad when your models are generated?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, I think it's a great example of what this morning and the later conversation is, we hope to do, is actually talk about the particular circumstances that are local, which allow you to do better or worse. The global models are operating at very large scales, and so they're kind of painting with a very broad brush. So they're not going to get down into those kinds of details, which in the end are going to be very important. So, that is a grain of salt that you need to take all the modeling results with. And in fact, the issues that you just raised are the ones that are going to be the on-the-ground truth about how good a job can we do and how much more efficient can we make that system so that we end up getting the most energy for every ton of bio crop that is grown or every ton of waste that is harvested.
Hi, Amber Robson from Third Way. So I'm having difficulty phrasing my question, but it's sort of around feasibility of the pathways that were identified. And I know that the strategy identified for the benchmark scenario some deployment rates that were needed to meet it. So that started in 2016. Build-out rates of renewables needed to be double. CCS deployment needs to be somewhere around 2 gigawatts per year. Nuclear deployment starts at, I don't know, between 2 and 6 gigawatts per year. So just trying to understand, how feasible this is if we considered delayed action, which is happening right now, what that does to feasibility, and if there are, of the many pathways that you say you identified, if some of those pathways start to fall off the table.
Certainly, if you delay the start date, then you have to go back and redo all of the analysis. And so if you have a delay, but still want to get to 80% below by 2050, I mean, the obvious answer is, well, things have to transition more rapidly than they would otherwise have, and it just adds to the degree of difficulty that is associated with meeting any one of those goals. Some will undoubtedly fall off the table as a consequence of delay. Others will have to be accelerated, and we'd have to go through them one at a time to determine which falls into which category. All right, let me turn it back over to our
Thank you, sir.
our chair.
Thank you, Jay. That was fantastic. Next is the break, which leads us into the conversations. And the first thing I've got to say is to those of you on the webinar, we're going to drop you for a while. My apologies. The next time that we are likely to pull up the webinar, depending on how these sessions go, is at about 12:35, if you're interested in that. But thank you for sticking through on the virtual cloudy world that's out there. And we greatly appreciate it. For those of you in the room, we are taking the break, and then we are going to get into the discussions of really, what do we do for Pennsylvania? And I'm happy to say that these are going to hopefully be very intense, smaller group discussions. We're going to be moving after the break that way to rooms 309, 310, and 311. With about probably 12 people in each room. And we had things like, could we do bingo balls? Could we do, decide where we would put people, hand out numbers, all that kind of stuff. We're taking the risk and saying self-select. All right, to limit the number of people in the room, though, I mean, to make sure there are enough people in each room, but also maybe with the suggestion that you go in with people that you heard from that you might not agree with completely on everything, get out of silos or maybe not sit with the people you've been sitting with all along. And in room 309, Bobby McKinstry is going to be the moderator in there. In room 310, Christina Simeone. And in 311, Aurora Sherrard. So you can also pick it on personalities if you see this list. There are a couple of substitutions, but hopefully it works. This is the part where we really want, there are no shrinking violets here. We've forced you to be shrinking violets for the last day and a half. Please forget that part and really engage. They've got some questions, but I also, knowing these moderators, they don't follow rules. So whatever happens will be great. So the break, and then to those rooms 309, 310, and 311. Thank you very much.